I want to show you what the book of 1 Thessalonians is all about. This is an amazing book, and we learn about a church that got it right in the face of stiff persecution. Now, if you want to understand what this book is all about, you actually need to know something about how the church was started. But you don't get the account of how the church in Thessalonica began from these 5 chapters. Instead, you hear about that account in the book of Acts. So we're going to look at Acts chapter 17, verses 1 to 10, because it's in that passage that we learn about how this church began. In Acts 17, you have 4 things we learn about how this church was started. First, you hear about how Paul and Silas first came to Thessalonica. Then you learn about how Paul and Silas came to the synagogue and started preaching Christ. Some believe, but some are upset. And that's the third section, where some of the Jews form a mob and start persecuting the Christians. And then we learn about how Paul and Silas are forced to leave this city. Let's take a look at verse 1 in Acts 17 as we get started. It says this: "Now when they," that is Paul and Silas, "had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews." Now, Paul and Silas are missionaries. They're traveling all around. They move from city to city. Oftentimes, they face persecution in one city, and then they're forced to leave to the next. And that's what had happened just recently. They had been in Philippi. Philippi is where they had come to share the gospel. They're arrested. They're beaten with rods. And so with bloody backs, they're thrown into jail. But God rescues them. Maybe you remember the story of the Philippian jailer who comes to them and says, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" They say, "Believe in the Lord Jesus Christ, and you will be saved." And so the Philippian jailer believes. But Paul and Silas have to leave. Where do they go? They come to Thessalonica. Now, perhaps a map would be helpful at this point. Here's a map of the Mediterranean Sea, and you see Italy and Macedonia. There's 2 cities that I've highlighted here. There's Philippi and Thessalonica. Here's how these 2 cities were related. There was a major road, a road that went through Philippi and all the way over to Thessalonica. This road was called the Via Ignatia. We have interstates. They had the Via Ignatia. When Paul and Silas left Philippi, they traveled on this road to Thessalonica. Now, this interstate, this highway, this road was so well built that you can actually even walk on it today. Here's an image of the Via Ignatia. In some parts of it you can still walk on. Talk about a road that was built well. So Thessalonica is on this interstate. It's a really good place, really good city for trade. Lots of people, easy to travel there on these roads. But there's another reason it was an important city. Thessalonica was on the sea. It was a port city. And so you could have trade coming on the land, but also from ships coming in. This is the city to which Paul and Silas now arrive. They come to the port city of Thessalonica. They have just experienced stiff persecution, but they come to a new city. How's it going to go for them here? Well, here's what we learn. They come first, as was his custom, to the synagogue. Let's read about that. In verse 2 it says, "And Paul went in, as was his custom, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and rise from the dead, saying, 'This Jesus, whom I proclaim to you, is the Christ.'" Now, this is what Paul would do. He would come to the synagogue. This was his custom. And he would preach. He was a scholar. Perhaps he's invited to come and preach, to speak. And what does he do? I love this passage. Notice what Paul does. He reasons with them. He reasons with them. Some people think about Christianity, they think about Jesus, they think about faith, and they say, well, there's faith over here and there's reason over here. And I'm choosing reason. But Paul was a really intelligent guy. He didn't just say, hey, here's this thing to take a blind leap of faith. No. He uses reason with them. He uses the scriptures, and he's explaining things, and he's proving things. That's so important, that Christianity is not something that you leave your brain outside and then you come into the church. No, Paul reasons with them. And some of them are persuaded. They're persuaded. So some of the Jews are persuaded to believe. A great many of the devout Greeks believe, and not a few of the leading women believe. So many people, that's kind of the second section here. Many people are from the Jews going, Paul's right. He's right about Jesus. Now, this would normally happen with Paul. Some of the people would believe, but some of the people were very opposed. And that's what happens next. Some of the Jews are extremely opposed. They say, here comes this guy, we've never met him before, and he's saying that Jesus has come, the Christ has come. We're not going to believe that. And so they get angry. Notice what happens next in verse 5. It says, but the Jews were jealous, and taking some wicked men of the rabble, they formed a mob, set the city in an uproar, and attacked the house of Jason, seeking to bring them out to the crowd. This is a terrifying experience. Notice that the Jews who didn't believe, they're jealous. And so what do? They take wicked men, they form a mob, they set the city in an uproar, and they attack the house of Jason. This is a terrible thing. Imagine your house being attacked by an angry mob. That's what they do to the Christians. They attack Jason's house. They want to bring him out to the mob. Now, thankfully, Paul and Silas are not there. They couldn't find them. And so, what do? Well, this mob, they drag Jason and they drag some of the brothers, and they take them to the city authorities. And they're going to have some accusations here about what the Christians are doing. But they take them to the city authorities. Now, here's what's really interesting. It's if you go to Thessalonica today, you can travel to the city square. Watch this. If you zoom in here in Thessalonica, you find the ruins of an ancient city marketplace. There's kind of this amphitheater-looking thing over here. And this is where there were buildings, public places where the city officials would gather. Many believe that this is the site of Acts 17. Here's a photo of the ruins. Here's the amphitheater here. And so can you picture on these very grounds, perhaps, an angry mob bringing Jason and the Christians and standing before the authorities and accusing them? Well, what do they accuse them of? We read about that here in verse 6 and 7. They're shouting. This is an angry group. Here's what they say. These men who have turned the world upside down have come here also. Now just pause there. What an amazing description for Paul and Silas. The men who turned the world upside down. Apparently, lots of people are believing in Jesus. They're repenting. They're turning from their pagan ways and they're turning to Christ. And in a way, the world really is turned upside down. There's another accusation. Jason received them. How dare he do that? It says this. They're all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus. One of the most offensive ideas associated with being a Christian is that a Christian's allegiance belongs first to Christ, even before his allegiance to his own country. That idea was offensive then, and it's offensive now. Well, those are the accusations that the mob makes. How is it received? Well, notice what happens. The people listening and the city authorities, how do they hear this? What do they think? They're disturbed. They're troubled. They don't need the heat that's going to come from Caesar when this movement shows up saying there's another king. They're disturbed about this. So what do? Well, they take money as security from Jason and the rest, In other words, they make them pay bail. They give them a fine. The Christians are being punished, persecuted, and then they let them go. Well, what happens? The Christians immediately, the brothers, they sent Paul and Silas away by night. You get the sense of the urgency, the danger, and they go to Berea. And kind of starts all over again. They arrived and they go to the Jewish synagogue there. Well, Paul comes to this church, and through Paul's ministry, God causes the church to begin in Thessalonica. What's going to happen? Paul leaves. He can't just phone back and say, hey, how are you guys doing? Are you staying loyal to Christ? He doesn't know. He's just on to the next place. But eventually he hears a report. The Christians in Thessalonica, they're staying loyal to Jesus. And he is so excited. He was so concerned about them. And so what does he do? Well, he sits down and he writes them a letter. And that's what 1 Thessalonians is going to be all about. Now, we're going to walk through each chapter in this book, verse by verse, chapter by chapter, and we're going to learn what Paul has to say as he writes back to this church that he planted in Thessalonica. All right, that's all for this time. Thank you guys for joining us, and we will see you again next time.